Okay, so everybody, welcome to today's call, and I want to thank everyone who's here and for your support and readership of JTA. I'm Ami Eden, the executive editor and CEO of 70 Faces Media, JTA's parent company, and I'm really thrilled, honored, not enough words to have that I have to express the excitement to have Yaakov Katz today. Yaakov is the former editor of the Jerusalem Post. He's an author of several books. He's got one coming up that will be, we're going to share a link for pre-ordering in September. While Israel Slept, How Hamas Surprised the Most Powerful Military in the Middle East. He's got a podcast with the Jewish People podcast, so look for that. And I will just say, Yaakov, I will just say personally, the newsletter, I don't even know how I got signed up for it or who officially sends it, but your regular newsletter, I will just say, I found it very valuable, especially since October 7th. I mean, it's just really, really hard to find the mix of people who care about Israel, but when necessarily willing to ask tough, probing questions about Israel, and three, actually know what they're talking about, right? That's like a very hard mix of three, and you have it. And so I really just want to, personally thank you before diving in, for your astute and balanced and probing commentary, always, but especially since October 7th.
Thank you, Ami.
Yes. And I guess before we dive in, I just wanted to add one more thing. We're going to probably talk a lot about some of the hard to comprehend feats that the Israeli military and intelligence are carrying out, but I did want to focus on one, perhaps the most high-tech thing I've seen so far, and that was the way you got to Israel. Can you talk to us about your journey before we dive in?
Well, not exactly high-tech, very low-tech. But I was from last week I flew Tuesday afternoon to London. I had a friend who had a book launch, and I also do some work there for some media, and had some meetings, and was going to wrap it up 2.5-day trip, flying back Thursday evening, and supposed to land back in Tel Aviv 3:30 in the morning on Friday. As we're approaching Ben Gurion Airport, this all begins. The flight gets diverted to Paphos, Cyprus, where we are told after a few hours on the plane by El Al, every person is to themselves. Figure it out. Which, okay, I know how to book a hotel. I know how to figure that part out. But then the question is, how do we get home? And as this continued and escalated, it became very clear that Israel had no intention of really trying to fly anyone home. And yes, that's the boat that I ended up taking home. There's basically two ways to get to Israel right now. One is to go through a land crossing, either from the Sinai, from Egypt, or from Jordan. And originally I booked a flight, which was supposed to take off around now from Larnaca, Cyprus, to fly through Cairo to Amman, and then drive from Amman to the Sheikh Hussein border. That's what I was going to do. And then last night at about 5 in the afternoon, 6 in the afternoon, evening, I get a phone call. There's a spot on a boat. Do you want it? It's leaving La Misol, which is 45 minutes from where I was, in an hour. If you make it and you're willing to pay 1,500 euro, the spot is yours. I didn't ask what the boat was, but I said I'm in, and I threw myself.
And Yaakov, just to be clear from this picture, this isn't like the top of a mega cruise boat. This is the boat, right? Like
no, it's a tugboat. It literally is a tugboat. It's like it tows boats. This boat is owned by an Israeli company. They towed equipment from Haifa to Cyprus because they have a hub in Cyprus. They wanted to get it out of the missile threat. And then someone random convinced them to bring back passengers. They had 9 spots that they could physically fit. Some guy knew about it, knew I was looking for a way to get home, offered it to me. And 17 hours later, here I am back in Jerusalem. So it was quite, but I'll tell you really what moved me. I mean, it was interesting. It was definitely an experience. But the people I met on the boat were really inspiring for me. I met a brother and sister who come from a kibbutz in the south, in the Arava, near Eilat. They grow flowers. They were in Holland selling flowers. They're farmers. And he got call-up orders for the IDF for reserves. He wanted to come back and serve his country. I met another guy, CEO of a company up in Carmiel in the north. His company now makes some high-tech thing or other, but like a physical hardware product. They fly it all over the world. They use air post, and there's no air post now. His company is losing clients. He had to get back to get back and help his company. And then someone asked me, what was it so urgent for me to get back? And the answer is quite simple. I wanted to be with my family. I mean, my wife and 4 kids. I have a daughter who's an IDF officer, 3 other kids who are home, and they're sitting in the bomb shelter every night. And I couldn't not be here. So if it meant going on a tugboat, I'm lucky to be able to have done that and be able to get home. So I thank you. Appreciate it.
So other than finding yourself getting to Israel on a tugboat, what are the most important takeaways from what's happened, and what's most surprised you, since last Thursday?
Well, I mean, look, the Iran threat, and I think it's important for us to keep this in mind for a moment and go back and give it some context, is a threat that has had this potential of becoming an existential threat for a long time. And Israel's been dealing with it for 30 years in many different ways, trying to sabotage equipment and facilities, to assassinate scientists, to use cyber warfare like Stuxnet back in the day, and all these other different kinetic attacks and covert attacks. And it was all meant to delay the Iranians. But a couple of things have changed over the last 2 years. The first thing that has changed is, while October 7th itself was a disaster, and no doubt what led to it was a massive failure that Israel is still paying the price for, there's the flip side to October 7th, which has been the re-engineering of the Middle East. The Middle East today is a very different Middle East than it was on October 6th or October 7th. What I mean by that is, what the Iranians did from a strategic perspective was they went for a nuclear capability. They wanted to always be on the threshold of having all the pieces and components in place. So they wanted to have the uranium enriched to 60%, not yet 90%, which would be the HEU, the highly enriched uranium, the military grade uranium, but they wanted to be quick for a jump. If they just wanted to get to 90, it would take a week or two. They were working on the weaponization covertly, quietly. So they had all the different pieces in different places, and the delivery system. We're seeing these ballistic missiles that tragically last night killed 3 people in Haifa and another 8 people in Petah Tikva. That's the way to deliver the nuclear warhead. So they were creating all the different pieces. That has kept moving forward. But after October 7th, what they also did, was they wanted to create their army of proxies and create a belt of fire around Israel. This was meant to achieve 2 things. One, deter Israel from ever attacking. So Israel knows that if they were to think to attack, they would come under unprecedented rocket fire, something we've never seen before. Number 2 is that if we do attack, we will pay a price for doing it, right? So it was two reasons for it. Well, what's happened in the 2 years almost since October 7th? The proxies are gone. Hezbollah's beaten back, is weakened, still has capabilities, nothing the likes of what it had prior to this. And Hezbollah itself said on Friday or Saturday, I think it was, that we're not going to get involved. We're not involved in this. Now, I mean, let's just people who are involved, just to understand for a moment. And I've been writing about this stuff for 25 years, right? I've written a book called Israel versus Iran, the Shadow War. Now it's the non-Shadow War. And I wrote about bombing of Syria's nuclear reactor. The presumption always was within the Israeli military establishment, you attack Iran, you will get hit really hard by Hezbollah. Hezbollah is on its own coming out and saying, we are not going to get involved. That's dramatic. So Hezbollah is gone. Hamas doesn't really exist anymore. Yes, they're still there. They have our hostages. We have to deal with it. But they have no offensive capability against Israel. Assad, their ally in Syria, gone, right? And remember, when he fell and Ahmed Ashara took over, Israel in 4 days destroyed all of Syria's strategic weapons. Their fighter jets, their navy, their ballistic missiles, the Scuds, their chemical weapons, gone. And then there was last year, in April and October, we exchanged blows with the Iranians. We destroyed the S-300 sophisticated Russian air defense systems. So when you think about this for a moment, that belt of fire, that proxy army, doesn't exist anymore. So the price to pay for attacking Iran has dramatically dropped. And then there's two other things that have also changed. One is we have developed capabilities over the years. We have more advanced capabilities today than we had in the past, offensive and defensive. We have Arrow 3, Arrow 2, we have David Sling, we have Iron Dome, we now have a laser system also that's being tried out. We have the American THAAD system that's here. We have the best missile defense architecture that anyone in the world could ever imagine, right? It's not going to be perfect. There's no such thing as 100%. And the consequences are tragic, but they fired about 370 missiles. A handful have gotten through. I mean, that's remarkable when you think about it for a second. But we've also developed capabilities to penetrate underground hardened infrastructure. We do it in the tunnels of Gaza, and we're now applying that also to the facilities in Iran. And then, of course, there's Donald Trump who came into office, and things changed. And we now know that there was close coordination and even I would say an act of deception that was coordinated between Israel and the Americans to fool the Iranians into them thinking that this wasn't going to happen. So when I look at why we took advantage of this window of opportunity, that's the answer. Now, where we are in this is we're just in the beginning. All right. And I know that's hard to hear because everyone wants this over, but there's more to do. Because when it started, if you look at what Israel prioritized its target bank on, it was first taking out the surface-to-air missile system. So basically creating open skies in Iran. Now, again, I just want to stress this because it's crazy when you think about it. We're a tiny country of 10 million people. They have 70 million people. They're 2,000 kilometers away from where we are. We now have complete air dominance over Iran. Sovereignty, I call it, not superiority, sovereignty. We control Iran's airspace. We have hundreds of drones that are, as we speak, hovering over Iran, gathering intelligence, seeing everything that's going on. So that's incredible. For any country to do that on any given day, but for little Israel to do that so far away is remarkable. The second thing we're trying to do is degrade the surface-to-surface missiles, the ballistic missiles. Very difficult, very hard. They bury them. Sometimes you don't always know where they are. The reason by the way, they mostly fire at night, although they do sometimes fire during the day too, but mostly at night is because it's more difficult to spot the launcher than when they wheel it out, right? So it's going to be obvious they're going to try to do that at night. They're rumored or believed to have about 2,000 ballistic missiles left. Figure launchers is maybe 20% of that. So you have one launcher for about, let's say, 20 missiles or so, much less. But what we're trying to do is go after the missiles, but also go after the launchers. At the same time, we're going after some of the nuclear facilities. We've gone after Natanz, that's their main enrichment facility. We've done a bit of Parchin, that's where they were doing some of the weaponization. Some of Isfahan. Isfahan's a little complicated. We could get into that later. And Fordow is really the most difficult one. And then there were the military command, decimated or decapitated, IRGC, and that's continuing, and the top nuclear scientists. What's also now happened over the last 24 hours is we started to go after some of their more civilian targets, right? Regime targets. So these are, I'm sorry, they're not civilian, they're regime targets. These are the defense intelligence headquarters. These are their media headquarters that was just bombed earlier today. We are really disrupting life today in Iran, and you are seeing tens of thousands of people who are fleeing Tehran and other cities. I mean, it's pretty remarkable that this is what Israel has been able to achieve. And now the reason this will keep going, though, and sorry to drag on, but just one last word, is because we haven't completed the main mission, and that is the elimination, as much as possible, of Iran's nuclear program.
So on that, when you talk about the main mission, I think there was always, if you go back and look like 10 years ago, it's, like in the late 2000s, early 2010s, when there was like a big anticipation about whether or not, I think when Ehud Barak was defense minister and Bibi was prime minister, and talking about if there was going to be a strike then, and there was one perspective out there that an Israeli strike wouldn't necessarily be to eliminate a nuclear program because they didn't necessarily even have the capabilities, but rather to force an international intervention. That was like one theory that's out there. And, I think when this started, there was very much seemed to be like the goal is the nuclear weapons, the ballistic missiles, and President Trump, while signaling his delight in being part of a ruse and, calling them excellent strikes, also has continuously talked up talks that seem to be aimed in a model of eliminate, end your enrichment, keep your regime, and do everything you want, but keep it local.
Right.
And it feels like over the last few days, you mentioned that now Israel is turning to, regime targets, and you have the prime minister openly talking about the fragility of the regime. Do you think that is the goal of this mission from the Israeli side now shifting to potentially bringing down the regime? Is that something that you see as now in the sights? And if it is, was that always where they're going, or is that a product of they can't sort of imagine how successful the initial steps were going to be, and now they see?
So you're touching on a very important issue here, Ami, which is what was the mission when we embarked on this Friday morning, and what now maybe has the mission transitioned into? When the operation began, and I know a lot of people are now calling this the Israel-Iran war. To be honest, I look at this all as one war. This is a war that started on October 7th, right? The war with Iran has been waged mostly in the shadows until October 7th for the most part. But since then, we weren't fighting against Hamas. We were fighting Iran. Hamas, Hezbollah were proxies of Iran. We were fighting the tentacles. Finally, we had the good sense to take the battle to the head of the octopus, as opposed to just playing a whack-a-mole game with the proxies. That this was needed, and this was a window that had to be taken. But the nuclear program was the beginning was the focus at the beginning. We heard the prime minister even say there's intelligence that they're moving forward on the weaponization. There was this window. We had no choice. We gave the opportunity to the Trump administration. 5 rounds of talks, 60 days, wasn't leading to anything. Something had to move. To your first part of before I get to what has maybe changed, I do want to say just one word about, because there was always a lot of skepticism, and you kind of touched on this, of what Israel could really effectively do with Iran. And let's remember, Iran scattered its facilities, has hardened some of them deep underground. Can Israel cause enough damage to destroy Iran's nuclear program? That's always been the question. We still don't know the answer, by the way. I'm not sure that we need to destroy Iran's nuclear program, but I also want to remind some of the viewers here, and I'm sure many of maybe, I don't want to call people older, but the older folks on this call might remember how in 1981, when Israel bombed Osirak's reactor, then it was Menachem Begin who was the prime minister, the assessment in the Israeli defense and security establishment was at the time that we would set back Saddam 1 year. That was what we thought maybe at the best we would do. Saddam Hussein never got nuclear weapons, right? So you never really know what will happen. And you're 100% right, Ami, is that from always we understood that there's only so much we could do. Take out some parts of the facility of the process, kill some of the people that's needed, set them back for a year, 2, 3 maybe, but it has to be followed up with something. Now, what exactly is that follow-up? Maybe it's these reports that we're now hearing that Donald Trump just spoke about a couple hours ago, that the Iranians are begging to come back and sit down and talk, right? So maybe now now that they're bleeding and they're hurting, they're going to be willing to do a negotiation, to really negotiate and agree to a deal that takes enrichment out of Iran, as an example, and removes the full enriched stockpile of uranium that they have in Isfahan, as an example, which Israel's being careful not to bomb because that could spread radioactive material, right? And Israel is very sensitive about that. Maybe more than we need to be, by the way. I don't know, right? It's an interesting question in of itself. But I think that with the success, what we are starting to see, and I think you're right, is maybe we can actually bring about a regime change. And this sometimes happens to countries who are at war, that they begin to think that maybe they can manipulate reality with their own hands. I urge extreme caution on that. I think that we should be very careful. I think that it's very possible that maybe this will lead to the downfall and the toppling of the regime, which would be a bracha for the world, a blessing. But I also think that we should be a bit modest and have humility of what we can potentially do, because it could also have the opposite effect. It could see the Iranian people unite behind the regime, and the regime then really race towards a nuclear bomb. So we should be ready to stop potentially when we feel we've done enough of the damage to the nuclear program and stay focused on that. I wouldn't want us to see us go down a route of where we make mistakes like what we made in Lebanon in the first Lebanon war back in the 80s, or what Americans made mistakes in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places, and Iran even back in the 1950s where there was an attempted coup. So we should be careful with what we think we can potentially do here.
And I was thinking about it, how quickly, you talked about air sovereignty, and how very quickly this took a turn, and it felt like, in some ways, like for people who know about the 6 Day War, right? The notion that within hours Israel had control of the skies, and there were some limiting factors, though, which is ultimately you didn't have an Israeli government that wanted to take over Cairo and Damascus, right? Like they could have, but like who would want that? But also you had the sort of specter of the Soviet Union as a sort of a we're who's going to step in? Forget about if the U.S. was going to step in, the Soviets were. So I guess like one thing is like as I'm wondering, is there a limiting factor as Israel? There was in that war there was, which was ultimately Israel didn't want to be controlling Syria and Egypt, and the Soviets were there. And I was also thinking about during the Syrian civil war, and correct me if I'm wrong because you'll know more of the details than I do, but there was definitely there was kind of a conventional wisdom that like the Israelis did not like the Assad regime, but there was sort of like the devil, a sort of, there was not,
Yeah.
Israel was not out there, trying to bring down the Assad regime. They were happy to see it wounded and struggling. And I guess I'm thinking about those two things. I guess there's not an exact pointed question, but I just want to kind of go down the string a little more. And I guess the point is like, what's the limiting factor? You're saying you're hoping for humility. Do you see any limiting factors out there?
Yeah, no, for sure. Look, first of all, Iran is a little different, but also one of the reasons I say that is let's look at the prior two examples of when Israel bombed and destroyed nuclear reactors, right, or nuclear programs. We're the only country that has ever done this in the world. It was a one-off. We bombed, we walked away. We didn't try to do much else. When we did it in Iraq, that's what it was. When we did it in Syria, that's what it was. Now here it's obviously a different animal and it's a different threat. And the Iranians, of course, are retaliating and they're responding. And we have to be prepared for that, right? Saddam's retaliation came 10 years later when he fired 36 Scud missiles during the first Gulf War. Bashar al-Assad never retaliated for the 2007 bombing because he wanted to sweep it under the rug as well. We know the Iranians are going to retaliate. They are retaliating. So of course we have to take out more than just nuclear facilities. But I think the greatest limitation and restraining factor here will be the American administration, the Trump administration. And I think that when Donald Trump, there was a report that came out yesterday, we don't know how true it was, but that apparently Trump vetoed the assassination of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran. Netanyahu has now spoken at an ABC interview just an hour or two ago and said that he might actually be a target. There's a reason, by the way, that Israel has until now not targeted the civilian leadership. It's taken out military leaders. It's taken out nuclear scientists. It has not gone after the president, the foreign minister, the supreme leader. The reason very much being is that we don't like them. They are our enemy. We never killed Assad, neither the father nor the son. You don't want to, there are rules to these games to some extent. You don't want to go after civilian leadership and then create an opening for that also on your side. You want to stick to the military targets. In the event of like Hezbollah, of course, Hassan Nasrallah, he's not a political leader. He's a terrorist leader, right? He might want to present himself as a civilian leader, so a political leader. So very different. I think that when the president will say to Israel, guys, time to wrap this up, that will begin to be the end or the off ramp. And it could be that more negotiations is what's also going to lead to the end of this. And by the way, it's in Israel's interest. Again, Israel knows it can't destroy everything. It knows at the most it can set them back for hopefully the longest period of time as possible, which might be 18 months or 2 years or less. We need the Americans to follow up with some sort of political process here. And the two go hand in hand. And it's in our interest for that process to follow up.
But just want to push you to explain your thinking, and I guess the thinking of policymakers who might share the view. If this is suddenly a unimaginable opportunity to knock out a regime that was born with one of its foundational principles is to eradicate Israel as a Jewish state, why is this a time for humility? Meaning, why? I can imagine some people who are listening to this or read this say, no, if Israel has the ability now to deal with this in a more consequential way, why do you want to have a regime in place that's both tyrannical to its people, but from Israel's perspective, more importantly, a dedicated, threat to its
because what is, I mean, it's a good question. What is regime change? When do we hit that point, right? So what do? We're gonna kill Khamenei and the president and some of the other cabinet members, and then someone else will be appointed? They're not going to be Zionist, pro-Israel, pro-West immediately. Somebody else. So we're going to kill that guy too, or are we going to come in, take the son of the Shah, who is in exile, whether in New York or London? We're going to install him. We are going to install him. These things don't end well. So I don't know. This then it becomes a very long process and goes somewhere that's not our issue. Our issue is, of course, we want to have good relations with the Iranians. We had, by the way, up until the 1979 Islamic Revolution, we had good ties with Iran. We had an embassy in Iran. We jointly developed weapons together, right? But Iran went down. Khomeini came back from Paris in 79. Things changed. And ever since then, it's a tragedy because the Iranian people are good people and they should break free. I don't know that it's for us to do. For us is to take care of our security, which is right now the elimination of their nuclear program.
You used the metaphor head of the octopus, which is one that former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has certainly used a lot. And I wanted to mention that only to just, I think there's I guess the shorthand around the world, certainly I think in the US, about what's been happening in Israel over the last few years is Bibi Netanyahu heads the most right-wing government in Israel's history. And I could imagine people who aren't so much paying attention see what's happening now and be like, oh boy, Bibi and his Yahoo cabinet are at it again. But really, and speak to this, what we're seeing now is essentially what the centrist opposition has in one way or another been calling for months, right? Can you put this in a context of where, taking aim at Iran sits in the kind of context of the Israeli political mainstream?
This is the most unpolitical issue in the most political and politicized country, okay? Where everything is politics. Look at today how the Yesh Atid, Yisrael Beitenu, Benny Gantz's party all voted with the coalition against an Arab party resolution against the government, right? Yair Lapid has said publicly, I disagree with Netanyahu on almost everything. We are bitter political rivals. On this, I stand completely alongside him. This is an issue that every prime minister has dealt with. From the days before, I would say from Bibi's first term in office in the 90s, we have been facing off against Iran. Everyone has seen it the same. Everyone has taken action. Every prime minister, every Mossad head, director, every IDF chief of staff, every commander of the Air Force. I used to be a military correspondent. I would sit in the office of the Israeli Air Force commander, I'm telling you, 12, 13 years ago, with maps out on the table and him explaining to me which squadron is going where. 12, 13 years ago. This stuff is the planning. So
Yeah.
it's something that is very unpolitical.
And say a little more about that in terms of how people are viewing it in the context of Bibi's leadership. Because in America, you have people who love Bibi and you have people who hate Bibi, and the people who love Bibi don't trust Bibi, and I'm sorry, the people who love Bibi trust Bibi, the people who hate him don't trust him. In Israel, kind of feels like no matter where you are in the political spectrum, even if you love Bibi, doesn't mean you trust Bibi, or it doesn't mean you're not cynical about Bibi. So you're saying whatever people's feelings are about this whole question about, oh, Bibi needs to keep his coalition together, or he's worried about going to jail, etc. That's not really in the discourse in Israel around this issue, as
I
opposed
mean,
to
there are
something.
people, Ami, there are people who can't see beyond their animosity towards Netanyahu. I'm no fan of Netanyahu. Anyone who's read me
Right,
over the years
right.
knows I can be very critical, and I have been. I think on this issue, the idea that this is being politically driven is ludicrous. There is an objective, what I described before, window of opportunity. There is intelligence that Israel has claimed to have. I believe that we do, that shows they're moving faster and forward with the weaponization. This had to be done. And for that reason, you see how everyone in the government and in opposition stands together on this. The what will happen to Netanyahu's career as a result of this is a different question. And I would predict that politically he will see a boost because this is, to be honest, I'm surprised he did it. I have to be honest. I think that I wrote a piece back in Newsweek in December after the October clash we had with the Iranians. I said Israel needs to attack Iran now, right? And not that I had any prophecy. I just said I saw how the pieces had lined up. There was a unique opportunity, but I didn't believe Bibi would do it because he balked at it so many times in the past. In 2010, he claimed he couldn't get it across the cabinet. In 2012, he claimed Barack Obama stopped him. He always came up with excuses. I wasn't sure he would have the guts to go across the finish line. And I have to say that even as somebody who I'm not his fan, I think what he has done is unquestionably and unequivocally the right move for the state of Israel.
So you have your book coming out in September, which really is a look at you mentioned before, the disastrous policies that led up to October 7th and what happened on October 7th. Um, And I know I hear it, and I'm sure and I know this came up when the beepers happened with Hezbollah, and I've been hearing it now. People asking that question: how is it possible that a country can do what Israel's doing right now? Like, no, if an Iranian leader is flushing a toilet into Iran, but does not know, when thousands of Hamas fighters are preparing to, launch a surprise invasion across the Israeli border in Gaza.
It's a question that legitimately disturbs people, and it's very troubling because it's like how we can know where they are, how they are, take them out, surprise them. We could do the beeper operation in Lebanon incredibly, but we don't know when 3,000 people are running across a border. And I think what it really touches upon more is a question of a state of mind. And when I look at the failures that led to October 7th, that's what it was. We knew Hamas's capabilities. We saw them training. We knew they were building up weapons. We knew they were digging tunnels. We listened to them say, we're coming to kill you and kidnap your people. We saw them train for kidnapping, but we didn't believe they would do it. We believed they were deterred. We believed it was all for show. With Iran and Hezbollah, we always took them more seriously. And as a result, we built up the capabilities to be able to counter that and to have in place. So the capabilities were there. The technology was there. Like we had Mossad agents on the ground in Iran building a drone factory, explosive drones that were used on Friday to take out surface to air missiles, defense systems, and launchers in an incredible operation to have that capability in an enemy country. We were able to do the beeper thing in Lebanon. Incredible because we understood that we have to allocate those resources, that attention, that focus to those fronts. That was the mistake we made with Gaza. So with Gaza, by not focusing correctly on it, by being in the wrong state of mind, by believing in a fairy tale that Hamas was deterred, we were distracted and we were not giving it the right attention that needed. And as a result, every piece of intelligence that we got we misread. Here, we didn't misread it.
Kind of the flip side of that question is what's happening. There's a level of devastation and destruction happening in Iran right now, but it feels very targeted, certain infrastructure, not aimed at civilians, and people who are not steeped in this. I can definitely have heard asking the question, how can it be that Israel can be doing this to a country so far away with such precision and such, in some ways much more difficult circumstances, and yet Gaza seems like a much bigger mess and civilian casualties, civilian infrastructure destroyed. Why are we seeing two different pictures in these two different theaters?
Because they're very different in the type of threat, ultimately. I mean, the way that Hamas embeds itself in civilian infrastructure is very different than what we see in Iran. Iran is a country with a conventional military that has bases and has military headquarters and military targets. The IRGC intelligence headquarters isn't underneath the Tehran hospital, right? Unlike what you see in Gaza. And as a result, I think we all understand. I hope that we all understand. Israel has never had any interest in killing any civilians, right? If we look back to operations that we fought in Gaza before October 7th, we went to the craziest lengths to avoid civilian casualties and collateral damage that we now look back and say, were we crazy? Like, what were we doing, right? Being so careful. When look at how we get attacked. It didn't really do anything at the end of the day. And I think we understand that that's just because of who we are, right? The reason that Israel is not bombing Isfahan in a way that would really destroy the facility is because we don't want to see radioactive material leak out into urban centers, right? It's because we care about them. I mean, I think it always really comes back to this main difference between us and our enemies is that we care more about their children than they themselves care about their own children. And I know that's hard to square when you look at what's happening in Gaza right now. And I recognize that complexity. But I strongly believe that it is really still true.
So move on that point about caring for your own and shifting it, I guess, within Israeli politics. I want to talk about how this does or doesn't affect, do you think will affect the decisions that Israel makes to the degree that it's their decision to make about some sort of ceasefire deal in Gaza to bring hostages back? Do you think what's happening now is going to lower the chances?
I think it will increase the chances, and I think it'll increase the chances dramatically. I hope so, at least. I think that a weakened Iran means a further isolated Hamas and a more constrained Hamas, and a Hamas that understands that it has to be more open to ending the war because it now has lost its patron, it has lost its support and provisions, and therefore it could meet a fate of where it's also completely eliminated. So it might have more of an interest now in a deal. And by the way, we heard this yesterday. There's now some indications, maybe, and again, bli ayin hara, knock on wood, whatever you want to say or do,
Right.
that we're actually maybe moving forward with some, positive direction now in a deal. And I'm not surprised. I mean, this is dramatic for the proxies of Iran that they now feel that they're losing their bank, their weapons supplier, right? This is going to have an effect on them. So I'm optimistic. And I know that in the defense establishment, they're also optimistic that this will have a positive effect.
Do you think it changes the calculus of what the prime minister is willing to accept in a deal? I mean, you've mentioned on the Hamas side, but does sort of eliminating, like you said, rewriting the entire region and what it looks like, does it make a ceasefire that perhaps Netanyahu would not have been willing to make 6 months ago? Does it change his willingness to accept whatever it looks like
I would
for
think
Hamas
that he can
to
actually
be there?
he can bargain a tough. He can make a tougher bargain or negotiate a little more harder because now we have something of an upper hand potentially. But I mean, at the end of the day, though, we can't ignore the fact that what we need back are the 20 or so hostages who are living. And of course, we would want to see back all the remaining hostages, including those who are no longer alive. And that has to happen. But the government, I think, has shown that flexibility by accepting the so-called Witkoff proposal numerous times. It was Hamas that wasn't willing to go forward with it.
I guess let's before we wrap up, I just want to talk a little bit more about President Trump. I mean, you alluded to it. You alluded to him. How I guess narrowly, how do you I think there was this back and forth about was Israel defying what he wanted. Defying might be too strong a word, but basically, he wanted more time, or no, he was part of a ruse, or actually both, or he's front running, or he's, how do you interpret narrowly like the last week? But and then we can take a step back bigger. But where do you feel was this Bibi making a decision like Levi Eshkol in the 6 Day War that basically I gotta act alone, or is this more about having a president in place that was willing to give Bibi more of a wink or a nudge than any president would have been before?
The planning for this has been going on for a long time. I mentioned before how all, successive and consecutive prime ministers have all been working on this, and of course in the military as well. During the Biden administration, there was definitely an attempt, and I've heard this now from Biden folks as well as from the Israeli folks, to get the administration to understand what was really happening in Iran and to explain to them. And I think people remember how when Biden came into office, there was back in, I guess, 2020, 2021, there was a desire, at least in the beginning, to try to get the Iranians back into the JCPOA. I think Israel played a role in preventing that from happening and making it clear to the Iranians to the Americans, sorry, that the Iranians cannot be trusted in returning to the 2015 nuclear accord that was reached at the time by Barack Obama. When Trump came into office, now it was obvious that Biden wasn't going to give Israel the green light or, give any consent, even if, in the Talmud, there's something called was it haskama b'shtika or something like that, or agreement by just not saying anything, right?
Right.
I think that Biden wasn't going to give Israel that, but with Trump, when Trump came into office, it was clear that he wanted to try to make a deal. And Trump came in and saying, "I'm not here to start wars. I'm here to end wars. I want to end the war with Ukraine and Russia." Hasn't really worked out that well. I want to end the war between Israel and Hamas. And by the way, before he came into office, remember, he was able to secure a hostage deal, right? Before he even took office, which is pretty remarkable. So that gave him this kind of, I think, feeling that he'd get stuff done. But then Hamas wasn't willing to play ball, and maybe Israel was also playing tough. And that war is still continuing. But with Iran, he said, "I believe a deal is possible." And for a while, it made us all believe, I think. And then he goes to Saudi Arabia, and he goes to the UAE, and he goes to Qatar, and he skips over Israel. And he meets with Ashara, the Syrian president, former jihadist, Al-Qaeda guy, yesterday, literally Al-Qaeda.
Right.
And suddenly he's lifting the sanctions, and Israel's saying, "Don't do it." Seems there's daylight between us and Trump. But we now know that behind the scenes, there was amazingly close coordination. And this was all part of some sort of, I don't want to know, maybe deception is not the right word, but an attempt to get the Iranians to feel that there was daylight, to feel that Trump was not going to let Israel do anything. And Trump kept on saying, "I believe a deal is possible. I'm optimistic we can get to a deal. We can get to a deal." At the same time, Israel had convinced the president that an operation was required, operation was needed. And I really believe that in this case, and from what I'm hearing, it wasn't that Trump said, "Green light, guys, go for it." But he didn't do the green light, but he also didn't give a red light. And that created gray area, gray zone that Israel could maneuver in. It's very similar, Ami, to what happened in 2007 when Ehud Olmert asked George W. Bush to bomb the Al-Kibar reactor in Syria. Bush thought about it for a long time, had teams, they deliberated, they debated. In the end, Bush decided, we're going to go to the UN. We're going to go diplomatic on this. And Olmert came to him and said, "No, if you're not going to attack, I am going to attack. I'm going to take care of this. Just don't get in my way." And Bush basically said, "Okay, He didn't say go for it. He didn't say don't do it.
Right.
But we do know that Bob Gates, his defense secretary, said to him, to Bush, stop Olmert. Stop him. You can stop him.
Right.
And Bush refused to do that. So again, we've seen in
Right.
the
Which he
past
did do about Iran, right.
which he
Meaning
did do
like,
about Iran. Exactly.
right.
So
He said the very clear. So you're saying
right. When they
an
want to
American
give a red
president
light, they
knows how
can
to
give
say
a red
no.
light.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. Okay. Do you have a read right now on where what you think what the president, what his goal is now? Do you see him as, yeah, he seems to be saying, okay, let's get back to the table. But now it's sort of we're without a compass, like where his head truly is at. So I'm just wondering if is there an emerging Israeli sort of conventional wisdom about what the United States wants to see happen now?
Look, I think the U.S. Look, we saw that Trump on Friday was actually quite interesting to watch. Did a victory lap, spoke with all the media, called up journalists, interviewed all over the place. Why? Because it was a success, right?
Right.
And when there's a success, he wants to get some of the credit. He wants to be attached to it. Makes sense. I understand how this president works. Israel doesn't want that to wear off and wants to keep that momentum going and keep the president on board. The real big question is going to be, will the Americans get involved? And that's where there is a near consensus here in Israel, where the answer to that question is halavai, right? We wish, right? If the Americans get involved, 3 B-2 bombers, game over, right? They can take care of business with Fordo.
But when you say take care of business, you're talking about nuclear facilities
Oh yeah,
underground.
yeah, that's it. I mean,
I'm talking about regime change. You're talking about
no, regime change is something else. But when it
you're
comes
talking
to
about totally obliterating the nuclear.
yeah, I mean, take Fordo as an example, which Israel has not really dealt with yet because this is really complicated. It's a much smaller, compact, hidden away enrichment facility buried a half a mile under a mountain, right? I mean, that's beyond what we can do. The Americans can do that. And they have the capabilities, a massive ordnance penetrator called MOP that a B-2 bomber can fly, right? Some people have said, why can't the Americans give us the MOP? Because we don't even have aircraft that can carry it. I mean,
Right.
so it's that can be done. Now, will Trump come and do that? I would say like this. We all can probably agree that if the Iranians make the mistake and attack an American target in the region, the base in Bahrain, bases in Iraq or Syria, whatever it is, that might push the president to get involved. Absent that, I would say unlikely, but, and again, we really don't know what the understandings are between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump. And I think that what we learned, as observers, as analysts, as journalists, as writers, and just regular people watching and seeing what's unfolding, we learned on Friday that we probably saw the periscope of a submarine all along, but everything else that was going on was all beneath the surface, and we had no idea. And therefore, I don't know. I would guess maybe there's a 50-50 chance.
And I'll end it. We have one, question in the chat that just came up on what you were saying. Wouldn't bombing Fordo create a humanitarian environmental disaster?
So what the Iranians did is they took they enriched uranium in Natanz, but then they split up the stockpiles of the enriched fuel and they put it in different facilities. So some in Fordo, some left in Natanz, most of it in Isfahan. Fordo is more isolated than Isfahan in terms of where it is located. By the way, you can destroy enriched uranium. I actually spoke to a nuclear expert about this yesterday to make sure I understood. But you have to really burn it you have to really obliterate where that stockpile is. So if you, let's say you have a facility and you take out the first 3 floors and the uranium that's enriched is on the 4th floor, it could seep out if it doesn't burn. That's the potential challenge here. So Fordo would be less of an environmental challenge, and Isfahan might be more of an environmental challenge at the moment. But I also want to say one other thing on the radioactive fallout and all that. I hope that doesn't happen. And God forbid that it should. But we are talking about the survival of the Jewish state of Israel. That's literally what we're talking about. This isn't a hypothetical scenario. This is a regime. You know, I'll say this. People have long wondered, why does Israel take nuclear weapons so seriously, right? When its enemies pursue them. Why do we do this? Why do we attack in Iraq, attack in Syria, attack now in Iran? And by the way, and if we take it so seriously, how come we let Pakistan have nuclear weapons, right? They're a Muslim country, right? I mean, that's a good, right? They're Muslims. They have nuclear weapons. Shouldn't we be concerned too? Because that's not the issue. The issue is very simple. It's the combination of a desire to annihilate us and the weapon that can give them the ability to do that. And that mix is what Israel cannot tolerate. We saw that with Saddam Hussein. We saw that with Bashar al-Assad. And we've seen that with the regime of Iran, the Islamic Republic, that for decades has openly called to wipe us off the map and has actively worked to achieve that. Getting nuclear weapons is something that can never happen. And they cannot be allowed to do that. So I say that in the context of the fallout and the environmental and humanitarian disaster. My heart goes out to the Iranian people, but we have to defend our country. And that's what we are. That's the mission and the raison d'etre of the state of Israel. That's what it was created for. So again, I mean, I hope we don't go there. I hope it doesn't happen. I genuinely do. But I also think that if it does have to go there, it's something that we did not want to happen, but we might not have a choice but to see it happen.
Yaakov, I know you're busy and sitting in Jerusalem with a lot of back with your family and a lot of things to do. So I will let you go a little early. Just want to thank you again for
my pleasure. Thank you.
And be well and be safe. Take care. Bye-bye.